Thank you so much, everybody, for coming tonight. We definitely appreciate that. We've learned from historians that one of the contributing factors to the Holocaust was the silence of German, European, and American Jews in not consistently speaking out against anti-Semitism. We also learned that silence connotes acceptance. I'm very happy today to introduce Rob Leikind, who has been a director of the AJC New England since 2008. A child of parents who survived Hitler's Europe, he grew up with a deeply rooted regard for the opportunity that American democracy affords Jews and other vulnerable minorities to promote and protect their well being. Throughout his career, Rob's been a passionate defender of civil rights, an ardent advocate in the fight against anti Semitism and other forms of bigotry, and a vocal proponent of a just and secure future for Israel and its neighbors. Our talk tonight is going to be Anti Judaism is Here and Now, coming to terms with our 21st century reality. We're going to ask that you point your questions towards me through the chat, and we'll moderate them that way, and we can feed them in through, and that way we can, or we'll let Rob talk, and then we'll start to engage with each other. So without further ado, Rob, I turn the floor over to you.
Thank you, Andy, and really thank you for inviting me to speak tonight. I've been looking forward to the opportunity, in particular because I was very excited to hear that Temple Bethel had adopted the IRA definition of anti-Semitism, and I understand that many of your members have also been involved in getting the town of Sudbury to do the same. I'd like to talk about that in a little bit, but first I want to just share with you just an incident that happened 10 days ago that seemed appropriate to mention tonight. My mother passed away about 3 months ago, and a cousin of mine was visiting from London, who is his mother and my mother were sisters. And I pulled out a box of my mother's photographs and various memorabilia, and I hadn't opened it yet, and I brought it to the table, and I was there with my cousin Michael, and we pulled the first few things off the top of the stack in the box. And the first thing to drop out was my mother's ID, her ID from Nazi Europe. My mother was 7 years old when Hitler came to power. And as the story was conveyed to me in the space of a fairly short period of time, she lost her friends. She was evicted from school, the school she was going to. Her father was arrested. And ultimately, that was their good fortune because they were able to escape, ultimately. But I raised that because when I heard my grandparents and my mother describe the experience, it was one where they had been accepted. They belonged. They didn't conceive of themselves as anything other than German. And all of a sudden, they were cast out. And I always wondered, how is it that people suddenly turn on people and cast them out? Did they hate them? Was there something else going on? And I think that question is a very important one, because in some sense, the question comes down to, what is anti-Semitism? We kind of have to know how to recognize it, what it is, if we're going to fight it. So I want to take a moment just to start out by thinking with you a little bit about what anti-Semitism is. I think when we talk about anti-Semitism, we frequently talk about it as if it's some kind of hatred that just comes out of the ether. But in fact, well, sometimes anti-Semites hate Jews. Anti-Semitism is actually about something much more fundamental than hatred. It's about a belief about Jews and Judaism that says that Jews and Judaism are associated with evil doing, with being morally wanting. Now, this isn't something that comes out of the ether either. For 16th, 17th centuries, the church, Catholic Church first, and the Protestant churches dominated the Western world. In that period, Jews were presented, not only occasionally, but as part of the regular liturgy, as the enemies of good, the opposite of good, the representation of evil. And that gave rise through particularly in the Middle Ages, to all manner of conspiracy theories that saw Jews not as hateful, just hateful, but to be feared. And that is really the essence of anti-Semitism. Even in the 17th and 18th century, when the church's hold began to loosen, anti-Semitism assumed a political form that we most popularly can understand when you remember that when communists wanted to attack capitalism, they called it Jewish. And when capitalists wanted to attack communism, they called it Jewish. In other words, the notion of Jews and Jewishness has been regularly associated with evildoing. And so to be suspicious of or cast doubt on the legitimacy of Jews and Jewish actors in our world wasn't seen as something hateful necessarily, but as something wise, a necessary caution. You have to keep in mind that anti-Semitism in the United States until World War II was an acceptable form of belief, not by everybody, but even though it ran afoul of American basic democratic values, it was widespread and held by very well-known popular people who are famous even to this day. So it's important to understand this, and that after World War II, anti-Semitism, the suspicion, the hatred of Jews, became something that was unacceptable because the cost of it became evident. But part of what people worry about today is that in the post-World War II, that vacation from history is coming to an end, and that we're entering into a new age where anti-Semitism in its traditional form is beginning to return and beginning to populate the imagination of many people who don't necessarily hate Jews, but look upon Jews and Jewish interests with inherent suspicion and see in their Jewish neighbors the possibility not of malfeasance in their world. So one of the things that we've noticed is, and we're all talking about it now, is that concern about anti-Semitism is mushrooming. I want to share with you, AJC did a survey. It does an annual survey of Jewish opinion. And the last survey was done last October. And one of the things we learned was that 90% of American Jews today think that anti-Semitism is a very serious or a serious concern. That's an extraordinary number. Something modestly less than that believes that over the last 5 years, anti-Semitism has become a serious space, become worse. About 40% of Jews today acknowledge that they will cover up the fact that they're Jewish in what they wear. When they go to certain places, they try to disguise the fact that they're Jewish. The anxiety about anti-Semitism has become much more acute in the last several years. And what we're finding is that Jews are looking upon, and we're seeing it in basic things. We're seeing the increases in attacks on synagogues that have been going on. We're seeing in the data from the FBI, for example, which shows that 58% of hate crimes that are religiously based are directed against Jews, even though Jews constitute only 2% of the American population. More importantly, what we see today is the emergence of conspiracy theories. We're seeing conspiracy theories from the right, and we're seeing conspiracy theories from the left. And let's take a moment to talk about that. On the right, if you look at a very well-known conspiracy theory, it is that Jews are at the center of an effort to mongrelize the American population. It's Jews that are behind the effort to bring in immigrants, non-white immigrants, who are turning America into a mud people. That Jews are the magic hand in this, behind what's happening, the changing demographics in this country. That theory led to the attack on the synagogue in Pittsburgh, where the attacker believed that the synagogue was involved in that effort because it had had a speaker the week before from an organization, Jewish organization that actually caters to refugees. We're finding it on the left as well. You all heard now about this point. I imagine you've heard about the mapping project that happened. The mapping project is one giant conspiracy theory. It's a conspiracy theory that holds that Jews have a special place. Jews are connected to all these different universities, all these different financial institutions. Jews are connected to universities, all of whom work together to advance American pluralism and the oppression of Palestinians. Now, one might ask, why the absorption with Palestinians? We live in a world where you have Uyghurs who are sitting in concentration camps, where Nigerian Christians are regularly being slaughtered, where there's a genocide going on in Sudan and South Sudan against Dinkas and Christians who are living in that area. The list actually goes on and on. You have the murders of the Rohingya, and yet you'll find that on college campuses, on college campuses, in various circles, particularly progressive circles, some progressive circles today, there is an absorption with the idea that Israel is somehow uniquely evil in this world. Israel commits the kinds of sins that give nationalism a bad name. No other country is given that attention. That reflects this disposition to see in Jews and Jewishness an association with evil, with wrongdoing, that has actually been a part of what has driven anti-Jewishness now for centuries. It's a habit of mind which is particularly Western, that has been embedded in the Western psyche and creates this disposition to see Jewish, which is not to say, very importantly, that honest people who are critical of Israel are anti-Semitic. If you were to say that, you'd be saying a significant, if not most Israelis are anti-Semitic. What it is to say is that the disposition to treat Jews and Jewish interests differently than all other peoples is a manifestation of what could be anti-Semitic. And we have to recognize that and be prepared to speak out about it. Which gets me to what I think are one of the central problems in the fight against anti-Semitism today. We can describe what it is, but the question is, how do you recognize it? The problem with fighting anti-Semitism is that until modern times, it's sort of operated under the rule, you know it when you see it. It's something that Jews recognize readily, but other people don't. So when people say Jews control the media, many people believe that. Many people think that. It's not something that's actually based on any data, that there's somehow some Jewish cabal which is controlling the media and what's happening there. But it's a belief that's widespread because it fits into a narrative about the place of Jewishness in the world. What we need to have is a language that helps create standards for understanding what could be anti-Semitic. And that's why when Temple Beth El adopted the IRA definition of anti-Semitism, it was so fundamentally important. And I'd like to say a little bit more about that. The IRA definition was created to solve a problem, a European problem, not an American problem. After the turn of this last century, there emerged a rash of anti-Semitic attacks across the European continent. AJC, the organization I work for, has offices across Europe. We are deeply engaged with the governments there, with police and others. We began reaching out for them to take action against the outbreak of anti-Semitism. And there was a surprising problem. People didn't know what made something anti-Semitic. There wasn't a language for doing it. And it was a problem because if someone went into court, there were laws against anti-Semitism, for example, in Germany, but a judge didn't know what made something anti-Semitic, and policymakers didn't know what made something anti-Semitic. And more importantly, there was no data that they could look at. And that led to an effort to come up with a definition. And ultimately, in 2016, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance adopted the IRA definition of anti-Semitism, which had been in the works for about 10 years. Now, something extraordinary happened after that. The definition has been adopted now by close to 40 countries. The Secretary General of the UN has endorsed it. The Secretary General of the Organization of American States has endorsed it. 3 presidential administrations, the Obama in an earlier version, the Trump administration, and now the Biden administration, have endorsed this definition of anti-Semitism. Perhaps the greatest miracle is there's almost uniformity. All major Jewish organizations have endorsed the IRA definition. The Reform movement, the conservative movement, various Orthodox movements, all the major social action committees, the federation movements, and on and on and on. So what you have today is the beginning, perhaps for the first time in Jewish history, for a set of guidelines that'll help us understand what anti-Semitism looks like so that we can talk about it, identify it, and begin to engage it. What the definition does is, the definition itself is fairly weak. What it has, though, is 11 examples of what anti-Semitism could be. For example, it says that blaming Jews for the Holocaust could be anti-Semitic. It says that holding Israel to a standard that no other country is held to could be, example, using derogatory language in terms about Jews and Jewishness could be anti-Semitic. All those symbols, 11 symbols, provide a comprehensive set of circumstances that could be anti-Semitic. What that means is that if people like your congregation begin to adopt the IRA definition, then we emerge in a situation which may be unique in Jewish history, is the opportunity to actually talk about it. Now, let me explain to you how this definition works, because it's important. The definition doesn't actually tell you that any person or action is anti-Semitic. What it does is it works a little like WebMD. If you go to your doctor and say, my big toe hurts, the doctor doesn't tell you, the WebMD won't tell you. If you go to WebMD and say, my big toe hurts, what is that? WebMD won't tell you that you have gout. What it says is, you have a symptom that could be gout, but look at all the circumstances. That's exactly what this definition does. It provides a language for looking at circumstances to begin to evaluate them so we can engage. We have, when I say we, AJC now, has been working now for the last year and a half to begin to get synagogues and municipalities to embrace the IRA definition. Because we understand that in an environment where anti-Semitism is growing, we need tools to fight it. It's not enough to say we know it when we see it anymore. We have to be able to walk in to a human rights commission in the city and say, this is how you can understand what anti-Semitism. We need to be able to go to a junior high school principal where an event has happened and say, look, we understand that sometimes these situations can get complicated. Here is a tool that you can use to help you figure out when things are anti-Semitic and to guide your deliberations in how you need to intervene to do it. In other words, we're giving, this is a resource that's not for organizations like mine, it's for communities like yours to take it and use it as an instrument for fighting anti-Semitism, to giving people the opportunity to begin to recognize what it looks like. That's the effort that we have. Now, I know I can already see that there are a whole bunch of questions here, so I don't want to talk too long, but I want to offer a thought. We as in the Jewish community look at the rise of anti-Semitism, and we have legitimate concerns. There's genuine anxiety today. I don't know if this is the case at Bethel, but I know that most synagogues I deal with today have enhanced security. Schools have enhanced security today. There's a sense that the Jewish community is not as safe as once it was. Every time there's an incident, such as the taking of hostages in Texas, or an attack on a Jewish person here in Brookline, the list goes on and on. Every time one of those things happen, it raises questions as to whether our community is still secure. Very often people will come to me and say, are we approaching the 1930s? Are we in that situation? And I think the answer to that is no, we're not. And there's a simple reason that we're not. Because we live in the United States, where, notwithstanding the traumas to our democratic processes over the last several years, we still have certain basic rights. We as a community are in a position to fight back. We're in a community, are in a position to take charge of our future. We're in a position to organize. And that's what we as a community need to be doing today. Because as Americans, we live in one of the greatest diaspora communities in Jewish history. We have unparalleled opportunities to protect our interests. The central question for us in the Jewish community today is, will we take those opportunities? Will we use them in basic constructive ways to advance our interests? The IRA definition is one way to do it. Obviously, there are others. But I think that the central challenge for us today is not to complain about anti-Semitism, not to be afraid of anti-Semitism, but to take charge of the fight against anti-Semitism. So with that, let me stop, take questions, comments. Andy, I give it back to you.
Excellent. Thank you, Rob. So the first question I have here is from Karen Blumenfeld. She said, Rob, thank you for coming tonight, and I'm very sorry for the loss of your mother. Eric Ward, in his brilliant article, Skin in the Game, how anti-Semitism and white nationalism, oh, sorry about that, it's just moving slow here, how anti-Semitism animates white nationalism, makes the case that anti-Semitism is at the core of white national ideology, and that, oh boy, this is going, sorry about that, folks, this might moving very slow, and that Jewish and Black-led organizations need to work hand in hand if we are to eradicate racism and anti-Semitism in America. How does this idea fit into your work?
First of all, I think that fantasies about Jews do fit into white nationalism. It wasn't an accident that people were marching through Charlottesville and saying Jews won't replace us. I think, it's not an accident that Marjorie Taylor Greene somehow saw a Jewish banker shooting space lasers to start forest fires in California. Somehow, Jews and Jewishness pop up in these various conspiracies that show up again and again and again. So I think that it's an accurate statement. Look, we have a role to play in exposing these events. We have a role to play in organizing opinion against what happens. So the mapping project is an example of that. Now, that wasn't right-wing anti-Semitism, that was left-wing anti-Semitism. But part of what we do in a situation like that is we work to marshal opinion from leaders. So we reached out to all of the congressional delegation. We reached out to all of our constitutional officers. We reached out to the leaders of the House and the Senate, first by email, then by direct contact. We also sent out, generated well over 1,000 letters of thanks to representatives who spoke out, and also letters to people urging members of Congress and others urging those who hadn't spoken out to speak out. That's part of mobilizing our community and leveraging it. Part of what we are is in a fight over opinion and shaping it. And so mobilizing our community is one of the most important things that we can do.
Thank you. Karen has a clarification to her question. Karen, do you want to unmute?
Yeah, thank you. Hi, Rob.
Hi.
Thank you for coming. What I was asking, and it was hard for Andy to read the question because it was a long one and it was not scrolling well, but my question was really specific to, there's an article by Eric Ward, who's this brilliant guy, you might be familiar with it, called Skin in the Game, how anti-Semitism animates white nationalism. And I can send you that link. And
yeah, please do.
Yeah, and he makes a really strong case that anti-Semitism and racism are inextricably bound because for the reason you alluded to before, the idea that Jews are pulling the strings on people of other races in this country. But the point that he gets to from there is Jews and Black-led organizations need to work together hand in hand in order to fight both racism and anti-Semitism, because they are parts of the same thing, which is marginalizing certain groups in America so that the small minority of, white Christian men can maintain their power. And I'm wondering, does that idea of solidarity with Black-led organizations fit into your thinking?
I think the answer is it does. And there are points of solidarity with Black organizations. There are also some real tensions. There are part of what we're witnessing today. Let me first say, yes, we need to find solidarity with African Americans and Black organizations. And, for example, we have in Congress a Black Jewish caucus that has been very effective. And there's been a lot of points of cooperation. God willing, those will continue. There are also significant tensions that I think revolve around different interests. And now it varies from region to region in the country. I think there is a lot of points of solidarity. There's also an emerging ideology, which is which is focused on the fact that race is an artificial construction that was introduced to oppress people of color. I think it's a proposition that may be true, that happened, but that if you're white, you're privileged, and that privilege is wrongfully gained. And unfortunately, in that paradigm, what we're encountering, not among everyone by any means, but increasingly, is the notion that Jews, in some respect, are the uber privileged people who have wrongfully gained, because they've been so successful. Now, I raise that not to disagree with the proposition that Eric Ward raised and that you explained, but to suggest that we're entering into a zone of complexity now. There is a need to find common cause. I think there are many people in the Jewish community and in the African American community who want to occupy that space. But increasingly it's contested by some who are all too ready to look at Jews in a pejorative way that honestly is difficult. It's troubling. We had an incident like this a few days ago, where a city councilor from Boston invoked some anti-Semitic views about the control of Jews or Zionists on the courts, and it generated a stir. But I think it also reflects that didn't come out of the ether either. That reflected a trend. So I think we're in a zone of complexity. There's a lot of hurt out there. There are a lot of people who are struggling for answers, and we're trying to find our way through it and sustain what I think is a very traditional alliance between African Americans and Jews, which deserves to be strengthened, deserves attention.
Thank you. Francine Jacobs asked, to what extent do we, or can we, as a Jewish community, need to organize to preserve our democracy, which still protects us, as you suggest? That is, for example, is it possible to sanction Jewish supporters for members of Congress who voted not to certify the 2020 election?
I think that safeguarding our institutions, democratic institutions, has to be a very high priority for the Jewish community. Our security as a community is tied to the health of our democracy. As democratic protections erode, you'll see anti-Jewish conspiracy theories rise and more instability that will affect the Jewish community. I'm not so sure that sanctioning, first of all, I'm not sure we have the power to sanction people whose votes we don't approve of, beyond the fact that one can advocate against them in elections, as you would with anybody you disagree with. And one can represent and oppose their views in public ways. That's the American process. Whether sanctions would function, I'm not sure what those look like. But I do think that you're raising a very important point, which is that we in the Jewish community need to get involved in the political process. People come to me very often and say, you know, I want to be able to help with a given issue. And my first question is, when was the last time you met with your state rep or state senator? Have you gone in, talked to them about some of the things you're concerned about, that you're thinking about? Do you have a relationship? Does that person know you? Would that person know you if you called up and reached out? If the answer is no, then you need to think about that. You need to think about it. There's no reason that your state representatives shouldn't know you, shouldn't know your congregation, shouldn't know the things you're thinking about, the things you're caring about, the things you worry about. That's what they're there for. So part of being influential, part of being able to cause that member of Congress to think twice is knowing that there's an engaged constituency out there that cares.
Excellent. Roberta Unger asks, it sometimes seems that Jews and Jewish organizations are out front about racism and homophobia and Islamophobia and Asian hate, but slower to stand against anti-Semitism. Does that ring true? And if it does, what is behind the reticence, especially considering the data? What are the implications to that?
You know, I hear that a lot, by the way. It's always a surprising question to me because it's pretty much all I do, is work on matters related to anti-Semitism and securing the well-being of the Jewish community, whether it's in legislative efforts, whether it's communal outreach. You know, that's pretty much what I do. But let me give you an example of something which may shed some insight. I mentioned before that there was a city councilor in Boston who several days ago, there was a decision, I think, of the Eighth Circuit Court of Appeals that basically found an Arizona law that requires businesses that contract with the state of Arizona to indicate that they don't boycott Israel. And the enforcement of the law was subject to a challenge, and the court found it constitutional. So in response to that, a city councilor, her name is Kendra Lara, from the city of Boston, issues a tweet saying something, it's not an exact quote, but, those Zionists are shaking you down. She was immediately jumped on by people who were accusing her of being an anti-Semite. She sent out a note saying, she didn't realize that this was an anti-Semitic trope that she was throwing out. She's very apologetic. She'll take down her tweet where she made this comment, that she wants to learn more about what makes things anti-Semitic. She didn't know. Now, I and a couple of colleagues from two other organizations responded and said, we appreciate the apology. We appreciate that she's interested in learning. This is what I said. Gave her credit for that. Now, candidly, I have no idea whether or not what she said was sincere. But it seemed to me that we're better off giving her the chance to redeem herself if she's sincere, and give her the chance to learn and engage with members of the Jewish community so she is sensitized to it and hopefully can sensitize other people on the city council to what anti-Semitism looks like. But I will tell you that I got a lot of unfriendly chatter on Twitter for doing that. People who thought that this was a betrayal of the Jewish community, that I wasn't standing up for the Jewish community. I disagree. I think we in the Jewish community need a strategy. Sometimes you have to take chances. We could have just slammed her and said she's just a simple bigot, but that closes the door too. So we thought it's better, the better strategy, if we're trying to fight anti-Semitism, then sometimes you got to get near and engage with anti-Semites. So I think that there's a rough conversation in the Jewish community sometimes about what it means to fight anti-Semitism and what it takes. If any of you have other thoughts about that or disagree with what I said, that's fine. These are the kinds of things we in the Jewish community should be talking about.
I have from Paul Rosenbaum, it's a three-part question that came up in regards to the mapping project. His question was, since you probably have more contacts with the police and FBI than we lay people do the police and FBI believe this act by the mapping project is a hate crime? Have the police and FBI sufficient evidence of a hate crime at this point? And if not, what would they need to draw that conclusion? And then the third part is, if the evidence is sufficient to conclude that there has been a hate crime, where would the police and FBI be in obtaining a court warrant to serve the internet company GoDaddy to force it to reveal the names of the people and organizations behind the mapping project so they can be indicted for hate crimes?
I don't know. The FBI is investigating this. At this stage, I don't know the status of their investigation. I will say that we have undertaken our own effort to look at the legalities of the situation. Um, the one has to understand as a baseline in a discussion like this that the First Amendment gives a very, very wide berth to speech, even speech that is unpleasant or edgy, like here, raising the specter that something more dire is intended by this, by what was done. So whether or not there could be a crime of some kind would probably turn upon whether or not there is an implicit perceived threat here. And again, my understanding of the First Amendment is that that is something that is not going to be a conclusion that's not going to be arrived at easily.
Jerry Kazan asks, I had a recent conversation with a very smart, progressive young millennial about BDS and the mapping project. Given what was said during that conversation and what I previously observed, it seemed that it's become hard for some to discriminate between the politics of the State of Israel and general anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. Do you have an idea of how to talk to people about this issue?
Oh, such a great question. Look, I think we've entered into a time where Israel and Zionism in certain circles has become a dirty word. And it's painful to think about this. But look, I think that there are people whose criticisms of Israel are informed. I think there are anti-Zionists whose views on Israel are informed, and that there are issues that honest people can debate. It's also fairly evident that there are a whole lot of people who have come to the conclusion that Israel is the worst place in the world because, and they couldn't find Tel Aviv on a map. There's an ideological stricture that is informing many people for whom contempt for Israel is a ticket into acceptance. It's part of a necessary set of beliefs for certain type of young people. That's a very painful reality. There was many of you may be aware that the Harvard Crimson about a month ago issued an editorial embracing the BDS movement. There was a very brave member of the editorial board, Natalie Kahn, who wrote a sharp rebuttal. But the problem is that the Harvard Crimson's editorial was all about gut and feeling. It wasn't about substance. It wasn't about facts. It was about conclusions. I encourage you to go and read it yourself. There was another letter written by another member of the editorial board who wasn't present for the meeting when a decision was made to issue this editorial. That came out this morning. I encourage you to read that as well. But again, you have people that are arguing against a mood. And that mood is placing Israel, not China, not Iran, not Syria, not Burma. I can go through not Egypt, not Ethiopia. I can go through a line of things, not Brazil, which is destroying indigenous peoples. It list goes on and on and on. The only place that matters in this new ideological construct of the time is Israel. And that's where we start to see the semblance of historic anti-Semitism, that disposition to focus one's moral energy and place Israel, the Jews and Jewish interests at the heart of people's moral universe. And unfortunately, that's what's happening, not because people are critical of Israel, not because they are anti-Zionists, but because their principles apply to one place in the world and only one place in the world. And that is a telltale sign of what anti-Semitism looks like today.
From Lisa asks, Rob, will you ask to meet with the Boston City Council member to learn more?
Lisa, I actually, when she first wrote this, she was being piled on by lots and lots of people. And I thought about it and I made a decision not to do that. And I sent her a private note and just saying, if you'd like to talk, let's do. I subsequently wrote when she issued her, possible apology. I don't know for a fact that it was. I sent her a note, a public note, which is the one that elicited all the criticism, thanking her. I have not heard from her since. I'm not going to reach out to her again. I've made what I think are 2 overtures. It's the ball's in her court, and we'll find out whether she's friend or foe.
Judy Goldberg asks, I appreciate that you said our security as a community is tied to the democracy. How does that fit with the endorsements of Congresspeople who refused to certify the 2020 election by the PAC of AIPAC?
Look, I think that the reluctance to certify the election was an historic tragedy. Even if one believed that the election was somehow had been corrupted, I think that Al Gore set an example for what it means to be a leader in a democracy, accepting the finality of the election, even though one could have argued that it was imperfect in the year 2000. Democracies we're living in an experiment. It's easy to forget that. We lead comfortable lives for the most part. But democracies are inherently fragile. They run counter to human nature. I think that people who I imagine were caught up in a passion made a terrible mistake. I'm hoping that people will be able to correct that. People who voted not to certify the election.
Donald Sherman asks, the IHRA definition and Israel conflicts exist. What are they?
Donald, I'm not sure I understood the question.
I'm reading, as we're talking, or as you're talking, I'm just browsing.
Sure.
And I see that the definition of anti-Semitism is a controversy in Israel. There are elements going on there, and I don't know enough of Israeli politics, or if I yet read your definition, the IRA definition of anti-Semitism. All I'm seeing is that there are vibrations coming out of Israel that the statement is causing conflicts. Is that too big a subject to say, what is it all about?
So I was talking today with a leader of the Chinese American community today, and I was explaining to him, the old joke about the old rabbi. He has two congregants who come, are debating whether the tradition of the congregation is that you stand up or sit down on a particular prayer, and and one makes the argument, and the rabbi says to this person, that you stand up, and the rabbi says, that's the tradition, and the rabbi says, I don't know, I don't remember, and then the other one says, it's true, no, the tradition is that you sit down. The rabbi says, I don't know, I just don't remember. And then he turns to the 2 guys and he says, I don't know. And the 2 guys start fighting, and the rabbi says, now I remember, that's the tradition. So there's very little that you won't find Jews debating. It's part of
Yeah.
the genius of our community. The IRA definition is no exception, so I'm glad you raised that. There were concerns raised about the IRA definition that somehow people would be punished if they were critical of Israel. That is based on a misreading of the definition itself, because the definition doesn't say that anyone or anything is anti-Semitic. It simply says, here are some symptoms of what could be anti-Semitic, and nobody has ever contested that those symptoms are accurate. But what did happen was there were there are many definitions, of course, but there are two definitions that were raised in response to the IRA definition when it was issued. One was created by a group of academics called the Jerusalem definition, and another was created by another group of academics called the Nexus definition. These definitions, rather than provide examples, it tended to describe what anti-Semitism is. And I think the fundamental purpose in both cases was to ensure that there would be no confusion with assigning people the label of anti-Semitism because they were somehow critical of Israel. I should add, I have no problem with any of that, if that's important to people. Those definitions, were created by academics and effectively are for academics. The IRA definition is good for policymakers, academics, and for the person on the street. And that's why it has adopted universal endorsement. So I will also add that we have had these discussions now at multiple synagogues where similar concerns were raised. I'm talking about here in Massachusetts. And when people come to understand what the IRA's definition is saying and not saying, a lot of the concerns evaporate.
Where's an easy place to get the definition in black and white?
You go to the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance working definition in Google. Just type it into your browser and it will pop. It'll be the first thing to pop up on your screen. If you can't get it, Andy will give you my email address and I'll send it to you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, I had a question which was more about how can you more specifically use the definition now in some of these situations. You know, when an army's marching across a hill, it's easy to say, that's what I have to go do. I got to fight that army. Right. When this slow roll comes over and you feel so helpless about how to fight it, you know, an incident happens in a school, you know, you say go to the school with the definition. Can you expand on that a little more?
Yeah. Thank you for that question, Andy. It's a real important one. Look, one of the things that I think is very difficult for us in the Jewish community to get our arms wrapped around is that most people know that anti-Semitism is bad, but they don't necessarily know what is anti-Semitic. In other words, the things that we respond to, things that we hear, things that are said, incidents that happened, and we instantly know what's going on. You know, when after the assault on the synagogue outside of Dallas, and there was the special agent in charge was holding a press conference in front of the FBI, held a press conference. And the extraordinary thing in that press conference was he didn't instantly realize that that attack was an anti-Semitic event. Now, that doesn't make him a bad person. It just means he comes from a different place. He's not exposed to it. He hasn't absorbed what anti-Semitism is. We have an interest, a big interest, in claiming this ground, in defining for the public what anti-Semitism is. And what that means is people, all of us, can literally call up the police chief and just say, you know, at Temple Bethel, we adopted this definition. We did it because this is some of the, we're concerned. People are feeling less secure. We want to share it with you. We want you to know what some of your constituents are thinking about. You can do the same thing with the DEI officer or the city manager for the town of Sudbury. Just go in and start having this conversation so that when, God forbid, the need arises, they know two things. They know who cares about this, number one, and number two, they know there's a resource that they should be turning to, and that there are people who will hold them accountable for that. In other words, we're informing people, we're engaging people, but not as enemies, but as friends. We have to understand that if we don't educate our communities, and by the way, ourselves, people aren't going to know what we know. People aren't going to experience what we experience. So I think in this moment, you know, to use your analogy, Andy, we shouldn't wait for the army to be coming up the hill. We should be doing what good generals do. They prepare the ground. They stake the ground. They prepare for what they know is we already know is a problem. We already know that there's a struggle going on. So as communities, we have the extraordinary privilege that my mother's family in Germany did not have, to organize in responsible, respectful ways so that we engage our neighbors and help them appreciate what concerns us, what we fear. I hope that answers the question.
It does. It helps. Thank you. Jeff has asked, who can inspire more of us to act to fight rising Jew hate? Can Massachusetts Jewish clergy help make this work a priority for congregations?
You know, it's not, I think congregations can play a role here, but I also respect that every community is different. Every community has different priorities, and I'm not here to suggest what the priorities of any single community should be. What I can say is that synagogues could be a natural platform for educating the community in respectful ways. I will also add that to the extent that we can be helpful at AJC in training people in how, in thoughtful, respectful, responsible ways to become educators about anti-Semitism. We are available to do that. We've been now working with synagogue communities for the better part of a year. It's patient work. We will start doing some trainings in the fall. If Congregation Bethel has people who want to play this role, we'd be honored to work with you.
I know that for the Combating Anti-Semitism Task Force, we would love that. So,
sure.
Anne, I see that would you like to unmute?
Yeah, I'm just curious. Have you spoken on, let's say, college campuses or to young people younger than our generation? And to a degree, it's not all that different from Jerry's question. How do young people respond to what you have to say?
Thank you for that question. What I find is, I'm not sure I'm right, but what I find is that there are people who are ideologically dug in, and that it really, you know, maybe in 3, 5, 10 years, having a conversation with people like that will become possible, but it's not really an effective use of time. What I also find is that there are many people who withdraw from this discussion, not because they agree with the radical critique of Israel, but because on some campuses, the price of disagreeing with them is too high. There's the risk of being labeled as, a persecutor, a supporter of genocide, a supporter of ethnic cleansing, of apartheid. And people hear those words, and it's very, very scary. So we are finding, and I think that there are some people who have courage and mix it up and get involved in these discussions. So I think it varies. I think there's a lot of people who turn away from these discussions. Let me also just say this about Jewish students. A lot of the young Jews who go to campus, not on every campus, not every campus is like this, but many kids are just not equipped for what's going to hit them. They don't know the history well enough. They're not confident enough about their Jewish identity. They don't have Israel experience. 3 years ago, we began a program at AJC. And I want to share this with you because if you know young people this might suit, high school students, then you should be in touch with me. We began a program that runs basically from November through May to teach young students about how they connect Jewishly, their identity, to give them a basic language and information to think about Israel, and to learn how to represent, talk about anti-Semitism when they see it, how to recognize anti-Semitism, and how to engage in constructive conversations about Israel. For many kids, we're hearing about it after they get to campus, and it's a lifeline for them. It's an ability to hold their head high in environments that sometimes get very contentious. We think that getting to kids in high school is very, very important. So if you know young people in high school who would want to participate in this AJC program, it doesn't cost anything. We don't charge for it. Please let me know.
Thank you. Lisa Goodman had another question. Rob, very much appreciate the 2 specific suggestions I've heard you make. Talk to our congresspeople and to our state reps and talk to our local town managers, police chiefs, etc. Are there any other specific suggestions that you have that we can take on as individuals?
Look, thank you for that question. There are 2 kinds of problems. One are the crises that we run into, and then there are the crises we didn't prepare for. I've been talking to you about the ones that we can prepare for now and organize to do that. We have a tremendous amount of power and capacity to influence that in many cases, I'm not saying that's the case at Bethel, but in many cases is simply not tapped into. There are situations that come up. Look, there are lots of ways to get engaged in the community. You can, our members of Congress should hear from people, and they should hear from people regularly about issues we care about. There are all kinds of ways to stay informed about issues that are, and I'm happy to direct you to the HAC's website. There are other organizations. It's important that both our senators regularly hear from constituents. I promise you, they're hearing from people on the other side of the fence. So getting those messages across is a constant. That alone would make it easy. And by the way, reaching your congresspeople is simple. We can give you a link to a simple program so that everybody knows who their congressman is, who their state rep is, who the senators are, how to reach them. And they count those letters. They count them, and if they see that they're getting 10 of one kind and 1 of the other, they pay attention to the 10 of one kind. That figures into their policymaking.
Excellent. I'd like to turn the floor over to Janet Martin Brower for one moment.
Well, if there are no further questions, I just wanted to express my thanks to Rob, who I worked with on getting this set up. Rob has been a wonderful partner, very responsive at every time, very willing to work with us and adjust his session to our needs. And from what I've seen, I unfortunately missed the beginning because I was in another meeting. And I want to say that in that meeting, Rob, your name came up multiple times as an authority, as a great presenter. I think you're going to get a lot of demand because there were about 30 congregations represented in that meeting. And I think you're going to get a lot of calls to help them spread the word. So I just want to express gratitude from the CAST team and from Congregation Bethel for giving us your time and your wisdom and your expertise. And also that you kindly offered that you might help us with spreading the word into Sudbury as we do what you were talking about, building relationships outside of our congregation, which we're already endeavoring to do. So I do thank you greatly.
Thank you for the opportunity, Martin. And, it's really a pleasure. It's a wonderful community, and you've achieved a great deal, and you established the IRA definition. The town of Sudbury has stepped up already and issued an endorsement. That's what good citizens do. So, kol hakavod, yasher koach, and thank you for the opportunity to be with you.